Summer in Detroit was hot in 1967, and people were anxious. War was raging in Vietnam, and the body count was growing, and opposition to the war was growing right along with the count. John Kennedy had been assassinated in 1963, and Malcolm X had been killed 2 years after that. Dr. King and SNCC had been leading some very vocal civil rights actions, but had only had some important, but often very symbolic, victories. For most people, especially for African Americans, life went on as usual. The status quo held. We'd like to thank you for joining us today in Facing Reality for Social Justice as we look at a fictional account of what happened in Detroit during the summer of 1967. I'll be talking with Peter Werbe about his book, Summer on Fire, a Detroit novel. This novel details how a group of people around the alternative newspaper, Fifth Estate, reacted to the reality of an urban uprising happening around them. Stick around after the interview for some boogie-woogie music. It's also connected to Detroit City, but a couple of decades before our story today. Okay, so let's get on to our conversation with Peter Werbe. Hi, Peter. Thanks very much for joining us today. We're going to be talking about your book, your novel, Summer on Fire, and it was published by Black Red Books. And at the end, possibly we can say to people how they can get a copy of it if they'd like. And I really enjoyed it. I think it was quite well written. And there are many themes that it talks about. And one of the things I had to do is figure out sort of how to pull that together, if I could, and just talking to you. You have the history of the city of Detroit. You have the city politics, the changes that are going on with the economy, with industrialization or deindustrialization, all of the things that are happening in some of the bigger cities around the country, but you focus on one particular thing. Everything is a reaction to is the people taking time from their lives to demonstrate, if you will, and we talk about exactly what that means, their rejection of the status quo. There was a rebellion in 1967 in Detroit, and I think that you touch on that in a very important way, and I'd like to, start by getting a little bit of an idea from you of how you saw what was going on with that. And I'd like to start with just reading just a couple of sentences from your book, which I found quite good, and I think it might be a place to look at what's going on here. This is sort of towards the end of your book, and it's also towards the end of the activity that's happening in Detroit, in the streets. And it goes like this: the uprising ended, if for no other reason than pure exhaustion, having really nowhere to go. It was rebellion by a despised underclass that did not demand any reform. It was a spasm of rage against centuries of racism. It was social revenge. And I think that is a quite nice way of saying that people were fed up with their place in society, and they were going to react in one way or another, and that's what we'll talk about as well. But could you give me a sense of what you were trying to say here as we watch or read about what was going on in Detroit in 1967?
Well, Wayne, first of all, thanks for having me on the air and for talking about my book, Summer on Fire, a Detroit novel. Yeah, I mean, I think it should be obvious, and some people may know, that what we're talking about was a massive uprising, a rebellion of the black population, which left 42 people dead, mostly, almost all at the hands of the police and the National Guard. And it came, as I said in that sentence, of a long trajectory that begins with slavery and ends with the remnants of that, which expresses itself in institutionalized racism. And I think at some point, I say in Summer on Fire, you can't continue to treat people like that and expect that there's not going to be a reaction. So I was always shocked that people were shocked that this occurred. I mean, there was a liberal administration. They were interested in, reforms. They were trying to tamp down this brutal and corrupt Detroit police department, in the 1960s, and yet, it was almost one of these, what do they call it, rebellion of rising expectations. People thought, wait a minute, isn't there less racism? Isn't there less police brutality? Well, no. I mean, there wasn't. And there was also a lot of social dislocation. There were coherent African American neighborhoods that were destroyed through what they called urban renewal back there, and the black population called it correctly Negro removal. And it wasn't just that they tore down poor people's neighborhoods and built rich people's neighborhoods in their place and a freeway, but it destroyed the cohesion of what these poor people were able to eke out of a life where they were always under assault, always second-class citizens, and pretty much just scattered them to the winds. Right. And some of them wound up in different sections of Detroit. And the area in which this black uprising, black rebellion took place was particularly, to give you an idea, the area in Detroit, which was called Black Bottom, and so called not because black people lived there, but because of, in the 18th century, the soil there coming from the Detroit River. There were all sorts of businesses that supported the community. Banks and shoe shops and clothing stores and bars and everything you can imagine. And when people were forced out of there, and forced to move from the homes that many of them owned, Detroit at one time had more black home ownership than any city in the entire world. And they became renters. All the businesses over on the west side of Detroit, where many of the people literally were forced to, were already owned, and primarily by white owners. And it also stopped completely black wealth accumulation, because like in why am I forgetting Tulsa? Like in Tulsa, in 1921, the destruction of that black neighborhood by force of arms of the white community. This was done by eminent domain and legal means, and liberals who thought that they were wanted to tear down the slums. Well, they tore down slums. They were much of it, but it also had a community. It also had cohesion, and you took that apart, and people just rose up in rage.
You destroy community as well as the slums, if you want to put it that way. And rather than fixing a neighborhood or helping the neighborhood to grow, they decide to remove that neighborhood or destroy it. And that's not obviously the best way of doing it. And when you talk about it too, I think you have a couple of phrases which I think are particularly interesting when we're looking at these kind of activities that are happening. One is that there's a joy in the rebellion itself, that people are taking something into their own hands as a protest. And one of the ways that you put it in the book is that it's an act of resistance to have looting, which is the reality of what was going on. But it's an act of resistance when you have looting in the face of guns. It's not just people going out to say, I want this, I want that. It's that status quo doesn't work for us, and you can shoot us, you can shoot at us, but we're going to react. And that's an interesting combination, I think. But it's part of the joy of the rebellion. It's a joy of people trying to say, we're going to try to look forward to some kind of a better life if we can, even if right now all that means is just protesting the way that we are in the street. And I thought you did had a good sense of both the joy of that, if you will, but also as an act of resistance.
Well, in Detroit, I would say 95% of white people would refer to that as the Detroit riots. To give it, I don't know what you would say, to give it more power as a collective act of resistance to racism. Most activists, most black people either call it the uprising or the rebellion. Riots themselves have social causes, and it doesn't
Right.
strike me as something bad to call it. But out of respect, I mean, I usually refer to it as the rebellion. There was joy. In the book, I quote the then Mayor Kavanaugh, because this is an historical fiction. So there's, real stuff in there, as well as fictional characters and different encounters, all of which, though, were, what would you say, sort of summations of people, summations of events of the era, and what have you. But the mayor at that time, Jerome Kavanaugh, said he went out when this riot was going on, and he said he was shocked. That term keeps reappearing, that he was shocked because there was a carnival-like atmosphere. It was a big, in the 1960s, hippies would put together free stores, as they called them. People would bring in stuff, instead of like going to the Salvation Army, you'd bring it to the free store, and then people would come in and go, oh, a pair of pants, or, here's pots and pans, or what have you. And so the ethos of the times, it was based on love and sharing, not capitalism and, commodity consumption and wage work and all that. But what I think the joy comes from, pardon me, not so much of thinking there would be a better future, but in the act of transgression itself, that was the joy. It was, I talk about one area where the two lead characters go, and everything is upside down. And that's a theme from the Middle Ages, where, at different times, I don't know if you've ever seen these drawings, horses ride men. I'm trying to think of, the people bless the priests. Everything's turned upside down. Well, everything was turned upside down there. Cars weren't riding, in the lanes that they were appointed to. The people weren't walking on the sidewalk. People weren't going in leisurely and paying cash to get a suit. Cars were parked up on the sidewalk. People were breaking windows and bringing out couches or anything. And the other thing is, when you were talking about the property is protected by men with guns. I mean, that's one of the major functions of the police, to protect commodity exchange. And so I remember seeing films of Ferguson, Missouri, after the police shooting there, and I'm thinking, these guys, they're risking their life for a six-pack of Pepsi, but it was because it was so exciting. Can I swear?
Is it? A little bit.
Yeah, it was their way of saying "fuck you" and your whole system. I've got the short end of this all the time. And now, it's just a big free store. So yeah, there was joy, and every once in a while it would turn deadly because the National Guard or the cops would come along and and plug a few people.
Right. Well, one of the things that's the main focus of your book, and I think it is what everything else revolves around eventually, at least. But there are responses. And let's talk a little bit about those responses. One is the group of people who are part of a collective called the Fifth Estate, and they're the major describers of the events that are going on. Real quickly, could you what is the Fifth Estate? Give us a little bit of background on that, and then we can sort of develop into exactly what were you saying about some of these people and what they were trying to do.
Well, the Fifth Estate began as a newspaper in 1965. It was one of the original, what was called in the era of the 1960s, the underground press. Newspapers were just the regular mainstream paper. Unions, churches, a few people like that did. Maybe small socialist parties or what have you. The Communist Party had the the Daily Worker, but community papers that addressed the political issues of the day just didn't exist. So the Fifth Estate and 5 other newspapers from around the country began originally what was called the Underground Press Syndicate. And by 1970, there were 500 regularly appearing so-called underground papers with a circulation of about 4 million a week. And this is astounding because there was nothing competing. It wasn't here. There's your podcast, Wayne, and then how many others? Thousands and thousands, right? And that's not to denigrate anybody's efforts, but unless you've got something, like 1.2 million followers, me too. I mean, the Fifth Estate now is pretty small, so I'm not, size. I'm not doing sizes, but it defined Huey Newton, the chairman of the Black Panther Party, said that power is the ability to define phenomenon. In other words, you create people's vision of what reality is frequently by one of the things by a newspaper. People would read the daily paper and they would say, oh yes, hippies are bad, anti-war demonstrators are un-American, women liberationists wear no bras and are threatening men. But then you'd read the Fifth Estate, and that gave you a completely different perspective on the world and the changing world, and you could compare what made more sense. Right. The Detroit News, the Daily, or the Fifth Estate?
Fifth Estate, right. Well, one of the things, though, that the Fifth Estate does, the people in your novel do, is they are doing 2 things. One, they're describing, if you will, the reality of what's happening in the streets, but also trying to figure it out for themselves. And they're coming from a certain background. They're a certain kind of people, a little bit mixed, but still, they're primarily white middle-class people looking at what's happening on their doorstep, literally, and but a world apart in some ways. And how did you see that dynamic going on? I mean, you're talking about more generally, not just the Fifth Estate, but sort of the new left that was developing at that time in the 1960s. And you're describing how they're reacting to what's happening in Detroit. Could you describe that so we get a sense of how you're describing them, in a sense, and what they're trying to figure out with what's going on?
Oh, sure. Summer on Fire describes a scene, what we used to call the movement, with a big capital T and a capital M. And it wasn't, and the novel, by the way, is Summer on Fire, is not just about the Detroit Rebellion, but the anti-war movement, the rock and roll that animated the city, and it created both a physical and what would you say, a zeitgeist, a physical community and a zeitgeist that began to define the era. It was one of rebellion. We took our cues in many ways from the rebellious black students in the South, and everything that was so stultified about the culture of the 50s, what they used to call Ozzie and Harriet, which was a sitcom of uptight, all-white suburb. And there was another one that always used to gall me called Father Knows Best. Well, that got all thrown out the window. And many of us thought that we were on the cusp of both world revolution and the age of Aquarius. And that, again, coming from that musical Hair, H-A-I-R. I don't even know, now I talk, I don't know whether people listening are 22 and born in this century.
That helps tremendously. I mean, there's a different world, different generation, which is good. There's different generation learning all of this. And that's what your novel does, I think. It takes some of the issues that are still going on today and says, well, they're not new. They're different, but they're not new. And these are ways that people looked at them and tried to deal with them and previously. But you also,
and what is it? Yeah, I was going to say, what does the book start with? An Israeli war.
That's
You know,
exactly what I was going to get into. You also had
sorry,
some
go
discussion
ahead.
of radicals. I think at one point somebody was coming into a room to talk to people and talking about the advantages of Zionism or something, and they were looked at as somebody who doesn't quite understand what the differences are that they're trying to express. And it's quite obviously relevant in Chicago today, where people are talking about what's happening with Gaza during the Democratic National Convention and everything. So there was a dynamic there. It was a dynamic of change of people who were more radical than others, people who were liberal, whatever that means. But there was a dynamic of people trying to understand exactly how they were looking at the world, because that was changing in front of them, and they had to deal with that. And that's one of the things that you were really developing in the novel. It is a novel. I mean, it talks about people and their lives together, and all the things. And the music is a big part of the Fifth Estate and the people writing for it. But there's also another response as well, and that's the response of the city politics and the cops and the National Guard. And that was very detailed, I thought, in your novel, talking about how they didn't understand what was going on and were responding the way cops do and National Guards do, and people in the Army responding with force. And how was that? And you go almost block by block in the book, describing the situation. Give us a little bit of context of that and some kind of a feel for what was going on then.
Well, you know, one of the phrases that people used in the 60s, I don't think they use it too much anymore, is the establishment. In other words, I mean, a more common phrase maybe is the ruling class. And it obviously wants to keep things exactly as they are because it works for them. They have power, they have prestige, they have wealth. And, you know, when the rabble at the bottom start making a lot of noise, they have two responses. And usually they go hand in hand, at least in this country. There's both suppression, and particularly if it gets too, you know, if it looks like it has too much potential, it's repressed. But then also, hey, we're going to let a few of you in. You know, we're going to maybe, you know, divvy things up a little more in terms of power and change the color of the faces in the major institutions without really, you know, altering the entire system. And the ones that keep demanding a complete change, they're the ones that wind up either dead or in jail. I
And
don't know if that answered your
it
question,
does,
but
and at the same, and you also give examples of that. One of the most famous, obviously, is what happened at the Algiers Motel.
yeah.
Now, for some of us who were around at that time, it did make the press. It was national news. But for people who weren't, they probably never heard of it. So could you describe what happened there? Because I think that's a good example of the reaction of the establishment to change and to competition for legitimacy, if you will.
You know, in many ways, I don't think that's entirely accurate. This was what happened was is that Detroit cops summarily executed 3 children. They were in their teens. They were 18 and 19 years old. And these cops were enraged when they came to this motel and found these 3 young black men with white women and began beating them and finally shot all 3 to death. This is, you know, just like now, they're trying to put a brake on police brutality and police killings because they being the establishment or the ruling class, they don't want George Floyd uprisings that disrupt commerce, and maybe even some of them have a conscience. I don't know, but riots are bad for business unless you're in the reconstruction industry and stuff like that, you know, or the construction industry, I guess. That and it should be known that the 3 cops got off that. Pleading self-defense, and the one cop was about 6'1", weighed about 185, and he shot this young teenager, 18, 19-year-old, and I'm forgetting his name. It's in my book. I should, you know, remember I have this whole movement, say their name. and he shot him once in the chest with a 12-gauge shotgun in a room at close quarters. Claimed the kid got up and still tried to grab his gun and shot him again. And an all-white jury in a change of venue location outstate, said, yeah, not guilty. But there was, yeah.
No, that's the kind of thing that happens much too often. And also it depends. It depends on, there are situations where, I think you also in your book give an example of, this would go back to the 1920s, where all white juries look at, with the Ocean Suite trial. And so it depends where someone who tried also to defend themselves against a white mob were found not guilty by a white jury.
Yeah.
What the context is so important, and the context of Detroit rebellion is something that the establishment, I think, would look, or not just the establishment in Detroit. People were talking just recently about William Calley dying,
Yeah.
and he was an example of in Vietnam of someone who participated in the massacre of Vietnamese. And that's the similar kind of thing that was seen here, that an all-white jury let these people off who killed these people in the motel, in the same way that the establishment forces, whatever you want to call them, let Calley go. I mean, he gave him a slap on the wrist, but there was no real criticism, really. Legitimate criticism of a massacre that happened in Vietnam. And the context of your book is Vietnam as well. And this is the 1960s. It's Motown, it's Motor City, it's Vietnam. It's a culture change that's going on. And your people, the people that you're writing about are responding to all the different ways that you can see the world changing in front of them and trying to find some solution, really. One is just the looting as a joy of rebellion. Others is trying to write for the Fifth Estate, trying to find a way of explaining this and everything that's going on. So it's extraordinary in the way that you've been doing that. And you bring up a lot of the cultural things as well in the book, which I think is extremely.
I was just going to say, don't forget sex, dope, and rock and roll.
I was just going to bring up Reich.
Sorry.
No, I mean it's a good example of things were happening in Detroit and every place else, well, in the world, not just in the country either. Things were happening, and this is a good example for people who want to get a sense of what's happening there, to understand the dynamic, because that same dynamic I think is going on now in a different way, different time, but still the same dynamic is starting to change as well here in this country. One of the things I wanted to sort of end with, though, is that this fits within the history of Detroit. We're talking about a novel about the city, and that history is fascinating as well, because you bring up the dynamic of the United Auto Workers, NAACP, the radical liberal, something that's really going on, that's trying to talk about change in a way of trying to help people out. At the same time, you have people like Father Coughlin, the fascist priest out of the area, and the Black Legion fascist organizations. What is that dynamic about going on then? And I just wanted to sort of end the conversation to say, what's happening with that dynamic now? How does Detroit see itself, and how do you see the city as you go forward now?
It's hard to say. It's become a lot more amorphous. There are no white suburbs anymore. Every suburb is integrated. You have a predominantly black police force in Detroit proper. When they had the George Floyd riots in 2020, any number of local police chiefs, including the suburb I live in, a predominantly black suburb, the chief of police took a knee, which was one of the things that were going on. I mean, on one hand, it seems that things have moved way beyond what they were in because we have, at least around here, a pretty integrated society. It looks the same in Chicago. There's a black mayor,
Right.
and but it's still, and people, racism exists. I think a lot of people are voting either consciously or subconsciously on the basis of their racist fears, but what no one really talks about is the economic structure that still has a country that's the wealthiest in the world, and by any realistic standard, which is not the government's standard at all, almost half the people, say about 42% of the people, some sociologists have said, either are poor or near poor. Yeah. And they go, oh, no, poverty is only 12%. Well, without going through what the figures are, I don't think too many people would agree that, a family of four could exist. Some people would have one or two people existing on what they claim four could. So we've never, it's the nature of capitalism. The rich get richer, and I don't know, sometimes, they make a little accommodation, and the middle class appears, and people like me, I assume live fairly comfortable, non-stressed financial lives, but still tens of millions, maybe even a good 120, 30 million people, face what we would consider, I shouldn't speak for you, what I would consider economic deprivation. And then that's when all the other fears come in. That's when the social stresses, that's when the social explosions occur. And nobody seems to be willing to really address that in any wholesale way, still just figuring around the edges, which ain't enough.
No, of course not. And at the same time, though, you even touch on alternative ways of looking at resistance in the book as well. You have a scene there where a couple of the people who think that they need to express themselves by bombing a post office as a way to deal with an issue versus people in the streets. Now, the people in the streets, as you said in the book, are not asking for specific reforms, but they're demanding structural change, really.
No, I don't think so. I just think it was you read the quote. I think it was just a spasm of rage.
Right.
One of the things, and I argue with people that talk about what happened in Detroit in July 1967, calling it a rebellion. Rebellion usually does have programmatic demands, or it is around specific issues. Even the George Floyd thing or the Ferguson thing, those were about specific, killings by police. What happened in Detroit? Somebody threw a beer bottle at a cop car, and boom, the whole city blew up.
No, that's true. But at the same time, I think the Fifth Estate is in similar organs of discussion are important for describing what the reality is of those rebellions. And the Fifth Estate, in your book, talk about the background and try to get it in the articles that they're discussing about why all this happened. And that is, I think, not as important, but is an important part of that process, because there's the reality of what's happening in people's lives, what's happening in the streets, but also the reality of how people describe it and what they're trying to see from it. And that's why I think you have newspapers like the Fifth Estate or The Seed here in Chicago, or all over the country in the 1960s, those things were happening. And they weren't the center of the activity, but what they were doing is being able to give voice to what was going on. And those voices go back and forth. You mentioned Black Panthers. They had their newspaper that talked back and forth to the Fifth Estate, to talk to The Seed, and people talked and tried to find a way to move forward. So I think that's also what your book does, is have that kind of discussion back and forth, which I think is why it's such an important description of what was happening in 1967 in Detroit. Summer on Fire is what was going on in both senses. Summer, the simmering heat, if you will, but the fire of rebellion is extraordinarily important. And the focus of it, with your with your characters is a newspaper, trying to figure out what was going on. It's a good combination, I think.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. If people can find, well, I mean, you can, it's on Amazon, it's a million different places, but you can go to my website, which is peterwerbe.com, peterwerbe.com. You can even put it together with a Fifth Estate subscription and get a break on the price of both of them. And that's just fifthestate.org.
Just to end, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about the Black and Red books. This is a publisher that published your book and another book that you have of essays. Is this the Fifth Estate publisher, or is this a publisher?
No, they've been publishing. You can go to blackandred.org and see what they have to offer. Somewhat, I don't know how to describe. Mostly, political analysis books of, of the times. A lot of them. There hasn't been a lot recently. In fact, mine was the first original one in quite a few years. It's a mom and pop operation. Actually, now just mom runs it. It's been going since I think 1967 or something like that. And they were good enough to publish this, and because the book was about Detroit, and because the Detroit Rebellion was such a marked the city so incredibly, and people still talk about it when figuring what's going on and what should be done even today. It got a tremendous reception. Also, the fact, I should tell you, there's historic footnotes in the book that are at peterwerbe.com that aren't necessary to read the novel, but expand on the history. And there's also a soundtrack because I mentioned, I didn't realize, a friend of mine, I don't know who would do this, but said there's something like 81 mentions of bands and groups and singers. And so he put together a Spotify soundtrack.
Fantastic. Oh, well, yeah. It's good. It's worth whatever time and effort that person did put into this. It's worth it to follow through with Summer on Fire. I'd like to thank you very much, Peter. I won't say it was fun reading, but it reminded me of the 1960s in a lot of ways. But it also reminded me of the kinds of discussions that are going on now that people have to work through as well. So it's a book about 1967 and about 2024 at the same time. So I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Well, Wayne, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for the great questions.
Okay, take care. Now for some music. Let's start with Detroit Rocks. That was Detroit Rocks by Montana Taylor. It was recorded in 1929 in Chicago, but it has a good title. Our next work is Wilkes Street Stomp with Speckled Red, sometimes called Rufus Perryman. This was also recorded in 1929, but for a time, Perryman was a regular artist in Detroit's Black Bottom section of town. Well, that's our program for today. Thanks to Peter Werbe for the conversation and for writing a fascinating novel about Detroit, but also about an important part of our country's history. Detroit Rocks and Wilkes Street Stomp can be found at Internet Archive, and you can find lots of their music at the Internet Archive website as well. If you like the ideas around the novel, send Peter a message, and he'll be glad to sell you a copy. And if you like the conversation, pass the podcast along to friends. I know I'd appreciate it, and I'm Wayne Heimbach.